The wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmon, and hardly passing it, came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lasea.
Okay, so Paul, they're traveling along, so they're going to leave Myra. It says that that Julius had gained passage on an Alexandrian ship. This most likely was a ship that was a part of a trading fleet, and its destination was marked for Rome or Italy up here. So there was at that time a commercial fleet that would travel across the Mediterranean bringing wheat. Wheat, of course, being very important to the people and to their food supplies. And so this wheat trade was very important. And also it lets us know this was probably a pretty large ship as well to carry the cargo. And so he finds this ship. It says an Alexandrian ship. So it's probably made its way from Alexandria, where they would grow the wheat and then traveled around. It's going to eventually attempt to go to Rome. So it says, sailing for Italy, he put us aboard. Verse 7, we sailed slowly for a number of days. Now, the easiest part of Paul's journey by far was this first leg of the journey from Caesarea to Myra. From here out, it's just going to get more difficult as you go along. That begins as they try to sail from Myra. Now, where they were trying to go, now this lets you know about how difficult it is. They were trying to get to Cnidus. This is where they end up. A little bit off course, right? Why is that? Well, the winds are beginning to blow from the north to the southeast across the Mediterranean Sea, which when you're sailing, rather as opposed to modern day ocean travel, you don't have the big engines that can push you across the winds. You're having to sail with the winds. And so they end up being blown off course and having come down to Crete. They come across here Salmone and into Fair Havens. And near Fair Havens is Lasea, which would have been close to the port. The problem is you had this huge ship, and Fair Havens is not a very big port. And that's going to cause cause them to have to make a decision about what to do. So trip started off, it's not going very well. Let's go on to the next section here. You go down to verse 9. Somebody read verses 9 through 12, please.
Now when much time was spent and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them, and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the land and ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master of the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenix, and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest.
All right, so he says in verse 9 that the fast has passed. Now that kind of gives us a clue into what time of year it is. I think it's interesting, Luke doesn't give us an exact time frame. He just says after much time had passed. So they've been here in the port, I'll show you the map in just a minute, but they've been in port at Fair Havens for a little while. Not sure how long, but we know what time it is when he's discussing this, because he says it's the fast. Now, what's he talking about? You may know? The Day of Atonement. When did the Day of Atonement take place? When?
It's like October, but
Yes. So
it's very surprising
it would have been in early fall, right? It would have been in that October time. So this puts them at around the 1st of October. Why is that significant? Why does that mean anything? Well, so here they are at Fair Havens. What they've decided to do is, because Fair Havens doesn't seem big enough, they want to come to Phoenix. Anybody see a problem with getting to Phoenix with these northeastern winds coming in? Fair Havens has a little bit of protection because it faces not into the direction of the wind, right? But look at Phoenix. It's right in the path. Although that's a very short distance, you might look at that and say, man, you just hug the land and get there, right? Remember, again, you're talking about a large ship that would need to have the proper depth of ocean to make it. So they're going to have to cast out to sea some, as close as they might try to hug the land. I don't know the geography of that area exactly, but their plan is, let's get to Phoenix, and then we'll winter there now, and then we'll move on. Now, why do they want to winter there? Well, these winds were a problem, as we've already noted, but their problem, it was actually noted that to travel westerly on the Mediterranean was dangerous between September the 15th and March 15th. You have 6 months of the year when it's really difficult to cross that Mediterranean Sea going west. Now, if you're coming east, you get those winds behind you, you can fly across. But going the other direction, it's like trying to swim upriver, right? And so this is a real problem. So they want to get around to, the older translations will have the word Phoenix, but it's that term Phoenix is what they're talking about. So they want to get there, and so they decide to do that. Well, Paul gives them a warning, doesn't he? What's his warning? What's that? I'm sorry.
We're going to lose a lot from this. That wind will affect the heights of the waves and stuff too, how rough the sea is.
Oh, yeah.
And all you got is sails and stuff. Besides, depending on how your boat is built, how it handles those waves, could be tremendously different. So when the wave, you go from 5 or 10 foot waves up to 20 or 30 out in the open ocean, that makes a whole lot of difference in how that boat and the crew is going to handle that passage.
Yeah, and we got 2 guys who are in the Navy, so you guys have some experience with this and understand how all this, the dangerousness of this. I've seen online videos of ships trying to what's the word I'm looking for? To move across these with these huge waves hitting them. Even these really big like battleships and aircraft carriers. You watch some of those videos in the water and how they just come up, and I don't know what that's like. I can imagine my stomach being in my brain, by the time we hit back down. I can imagine doing that in a wooden ship, much less a metal ship. And so Paul says, Now, I think what's interesting here is Paul talking out of Holy Spirit inspiration or just out of wisdom. It seems like to me this is Paul's wisdom saying, y'all are about to do something really dumb. You're going to cost us a lot. The reason I say this is probably not Holy Spirit inspired is because later on he's actually told none of y'all are going to die. And that, I believe, I know, is God's communicating to him. I think here he's just like, you got to be smarter about this. Let's stay here, winter here, and then in the spring we can head out. But unfortunately, they don't listen to him. They do decide to head out. All right, let's go on. Let's see. What verse are we at? Oh, yeah. Okay. So in this next section, things are just going to get rougher on them. We'll go down to verse 13. Somebody read 13 through 17, please.
When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they also sailed, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose, called Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Claudia, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Cydrus sands, they struck sail and so were driven.
All right, so let's talk about this for just a minute. So it says, when they first started out, we go back to the map here. So they're starting out from Fair Havens. At the first, they actually have a wind at their back, and they're like, we can just manage this, go around the coast. But man, it's not long before that northeaster, which is that older translations will have the other term. I don't have it. Euroclydon. That's just another way of saying northeaster. It's a reference to this wind that occurs at that time of year. Well, that wind hits them, and you notice here on the trail what happens. They're driven south. They're able to get a little bit against it, but they're not making any progress. They actually are going to become very concerned, and you can see why, that they're going to get into Cyrene before they realize it, and they're going to be shipwrecked. And so what they decide to do, they lower the sails, and they run on the lee of a small island. Now, it is very small on this map, but that island is right there. So just like they did, like the other ship did around Cyprus, they try to use that island, going down the south of it, to use it as a barrier for the wind. And maybe somewhat successful. They run on the lee of that island, and then they notice they have a trailing small vessel that would be used to get people off the ship and to the port, which they had planned to do at Phoenix. This boat is trailing them from behind. Well, they have to secure that boat onto the ship. Now, this may have been a similar view of what their ship may have looked like. One of the other things I think is interesting that they did, something, get used to that, is they decide to run chains underneath the ship to undergird it. Why do they do that?
Hold it together.
Hold it together, right? Those chains, that metal, would help to support this wooden structure. And so with difficulty, it says, they managed, verse 17, they use supports to undergird the ship. So they use those chains to help to fasten it, to help hold it together. They lowered the gear, they lowered the sails, and moved along. Now that word Syrtis is another reference to Cyrene down here in the outer portions of Cyrene. They didn't want to hit one of those, like reef-like areas where the sand would pile up later on. It's going to be interesting. It's exactly what happens, but at a different place. So let's move on. Any questions about any of that? I'm not a sea expert by any means, or ship expert, but this is what I understand from my study. But let's move on to 18. It says in verse 18, since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Luke is trying to give us a picture of maybe what it was like on the ship. I can imagine how scary this must have been. And he gives us some clues into what the condition was really like. Number one, he notes in verse 18 that you're storm tossed, kind of like Doug was saying. You don't just have the wind buffeting you, but it's the waves. And then it's also the fact you have no sunlight. Now, why is that significant to discuss, other than just creating an atmosphere of conditions? Why is it important to note that there wasn't any sunlight?
You got zero navigation.
How are you going to navigate? They didn't have, sonic navigation or, any of the modern tools we have to navigate through, cloudy periods. How do they navigate? Using the stars. They, what's that tool they used? Oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. They had a tool they would use to navigate based on the star. What?
A sundown?
Sextant?
What was it?
Sextant?
The sextant? Maybe it was. Maybe it's one of them. But I know they had a tool, like object that they would use to navigate. Well, when you don't have stars, what are you going to do? And so he says, with all this going on and everything against them, what's the attitude on the ship? We're dead, right? Right? This is eventually going to get us. And so Luke gives us a little bit of a picture, insight into that. Not the same with Paul. Notice verse 21. Somebody read 21 through 26.
But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island.
All right, so when you're depressed, what's one of the best signs to look for depression in someone? Anybody know? Stop eating. All right? Someone who doesn't want to eat anymore, someone who doesn't participate in habits and things they enjoyed. You notice those changes. Well, they think they're going to die. Well, they're just not eating, right? And Luke notes that. He kind of give us, it also would speak to their physical condition. You don't eat when you're in these high, intense moments constantly. That's going to affect you physically, isn't it, if you're not replenishing yourself? Lisa runs every other day, 4 miles or more, right? If she didn't eat on a regular basis, what's that going to do eventually? Physically, you're actually going to be hurting yourself by continuing to run and not eat. You need both of those. There has to be a balance there. Well, you've got these men who are in this desperate situation. They're not eating. And then Paul gets up and he says, Man, you ought to listen to me. Do you think he's trying to be kind of, I got you on this? I don't think he is. What do you think? Why does he bring that up for? He says, you should have listened to me. Why bring that up? I think what he's trying to say to him, you didn't listen to me then, please listen to me now. I told you what was going to happen, you didn't listen. Now we're in the situation, but. And this is why I think before Paul was speaking more out of his what he understood more than what God was prophesying to him. Here he actually lays out a prophecy for him, doesn't he? What does he say?
An angel of God came to him.
They're going to be okay.
And he says, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And so unlike everybody else, Paul isn't sitting there, depressed and out of wits here. He says, an angel of God has told me we're going to get to Rome. He does, though. He says, the angel says, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. So in other words, you're getting to Rome. And God has granted all those who sail with you. So in other words, what he's saying is, you're going to live through this. Later on, he'll say, not a hair on your head will be damaged. However, he says in verse 26, we must run aground on some island. Keep that in mind. So that is a prophetic statement for later on. This is the second time in the book of Acts that we read where Paul has been told by God that eventually he was going to make it to Rome. You may remember in Acts 23 verse 11, there it says the Lord stood by him, Acts 23 verse 11, and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. And so Paul already knew, I don't know how God's going to do it, but I'm going to get to Rome. I always think about Abraham with Isaac. You go to the book of Hebrews, and the Hebrews writer, what does he say about that period when God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? You know what the Hebrews writer says about what Abraham thought about that? Anybody remember?
Raise him from the dead.
What's that?
He would raise him.
Well, yeah, so the Hebrew text tells us Abraham didn't know what God was going to do, but he knew God would fulfill his promise. Now, he thought, Hebrews writer closes in it, that Abraham thought in the moment that what God was going to do was just resurrect him. But he relied on the promise of God. And so now it's a challenge for Paul is to rely on the promise of God. God told him that, and so now it was up to Paul to believe it. And it sure seems like he does. So we go down to verse 27. It says, when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the soldiers suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little further, they took another sounding and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, they lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship and let it go. So you've got 2 weeks here have come and gone, and they've been enduring this tossing back and forth, this unsureness of what's going to happen. And as they're moving along, they're getting concerned about what?
Running the ground.
Yeah, they're getting concerned about, having the ship shipwrecked. And so they start doing these soundings. Now, I really don't know what soundings are. From what I understand, fathoms is a reference to depth, and it's, I believe 20 fathoms is about 120 feet under, and 15 then would be about 90 feet down. You can test my knowledge on that. I'm not going to claim I understand what they're doing. But they're measuring the depth of the sea. Again, the concern about the bow of the ship hitting land and being broke apart. And so then you have some of these sailors who understand what kind of despair they're in. They decide, you know what, we've got that little boat back there, we'll be better off in that, let's get in it and go. And Paul, it's interesting, he goes to the centurion and says, if you let those men get out of here, you, and he says this to him, you will not be saved. Now, the centurion didn't believe him at Fairhavens, didn't take his word for it. Does he do it this time? Yeah. And luckily they did, because it's probably through their efforts that the ship was saved. And so now you have, who knows where you're at, maybe somewhere in this area. It says the Adriatic Sea. I believe that's this area here. They're somewhere there, this line's there, but who knows if that's really where they are. But they're lost at sea at this point. All right, somebody read 33 through 38.
The day was about to dawn. Paul urged them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all. He broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea.
So you have them moving along. It's been, as noted, 2 weeks. Paul looking around at the men, and he notices what's going on. That here they are, terrified and not eating. Can you imagine not eating for 2 weeks? It's hard for me to imagine not eating for like 2 hours, right? 2 weeks with really not eating. I mean, how tough is that? And what condition they must have been in. And so Paul, wanting to do something about it, actually urges them to eat. He reminds them about the prophecy that they will not be harmed. And then what does he do?
Breaks bread and gives thanks.
I was watching a show the other night, and they had it was about a royal family, and they had a royal taste tester there, right? Taste tester does what? What's the job of a taste tester? Check for poison, right? To kind of show it's all okay, and so it gives the person who's going to eat confidence that whatever they're eating is okay. And so you've kind of got a situation here where Paul, it's not enough just to talk to them, but what does he do? He does it. He shows them by example, the power of example. And what's interesting is for 2 weeks they haven't eaten because they've been so terrified. Well, they see Paul eating, what happens? They all jump up and start eating. I think that's fascinating. I don't think I would have to wait for somebody, even if I thought I was going to die, I'd be like, at least I'm going to go out fat and happy, right? But here they are, they're not eating. And so he does that, and of course he blesses it. Of course, a great example about what we need to remember.
He may also be thinking too. He says, it'll give you strength. He told them that the ship was going to be wrecked.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to probably be in the water. So if you haven't eaten anything in 2 weeks, you're that exhausted, and then you have to go overboard. It's going to be tough swimming.
Yeah, good point.
You need a little bit of something.
You're going to need something in the tank to get you through it. Good point. And that's exactly what happens. I think it's also interesting here that Luke notes how many people are on board? 276. That lets you know something about the size of the ship. This isn't some small galley that's going across the water. This is a huge boat that's making its way across. All right. So in this last section, we'll move through here real quickly. In verse 39, it says, "Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach." So it's cleared up enough where they don't know where they are, but they see a bay, and there's a beach out there, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So Paul already said, you got to run it ashore. So let's try to do that. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea to get rid of that weight, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Why would you tie rudders? Might be a question for one of our navigators.
Were they tied up?
That's a good question. I really don't know. I don't
When
know.
your rudders break off, you're done. I mean, you're just gonna be.
Yeah, how are you going to find direction?
Waves and probably capsize.
Yeah, and maybe they didn't want them flapping back and forth. I really don't understand that.
What verse?
Verse 40.
Mine says, and when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea and loosed the rubber bands and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and made toward shore. Like, almost like they were tying them up to help with the goat.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with that kind of activity to know what it means. But they loosen up the rudders. They then hoist the foresail, which is the big sail, which would be the thing that captured the wind, and they make for the land. It says, to the foresail they made for the beach, but striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. Oh man, is that time? I had one little section to go. And so you've got they're trying to make as much speed, I guess, as possible, trying to free the ship up. They want to get it up onto the beach. I'm assuming that was the plan. But one thing I read noted that a lot of times when you have two seas meet each other, you get these swirling currents that swirl around. And when they swirl, what does it do? It will create these, going to the beach, you can see these at times, these areas out in the sea where you have these sandbars that come across. And I imagine, again, I'm speaking out of my own knowledge base here a little bit, but I imagine that some of that is from that movement of water, which causes the sand to build up these sandbars. Now, I know I've been out fishing with Trevor before, and you run up on a sandbar, it's no fun to try to get off of. And that's in a little boat. I can't imagine a big ship like this. Watching, what was that? Family Robinson. What is the name of that movie? But Swiss Family Robinson. Isn't that what happens in that? Don't they kind of run aground on a reef and the ship ends up getting beat up and broken up? Well, that's kind of what happens. It gets into that reef and it gets stuck. You can't move it out. You got this huge ship with all this weight on it. Even though they've jettisoned all this stuff, it wasn't enough, of course, to get it over that reef. Can I do this last one and I'll shut up real quickly. Verses 42 and following. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. So it was that all were brought safely to land. And so the providence God playing out here with the centurion, his relationship he's built with Paul, led him to protecting Paul. In our next class, it'll be our last class on the book of Acts. We'll finish this up in chapter 28 and look at Paul, the rest of his journey to Rome, what happens on Malta, and traveling on. Thank you all so much. We'll be dismissed for our devotional time.